This House supports Greek youth, violently protesting against Trojka mandated austerity measures. Standing orders are as usual. I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the case and stand her name.
Austerity is a terrible thing. Austerity is a policy that has the most victims of society, and it wasn't even that it works in other countries in the world. Austerity creates a lost generation that has no jobs, that has no future to look forward to. It creates unemployment of people that used to have a dignified job, and now they go home and they cannot earn even the respect of their family because they cannot bring back home the bread that they used to. We believe that this causes people not only to despair, but to turn into other measures which are counterproductive. And you know what is worse? That while there are other alternatives, like increasing the budget of that country, of giving loans by other countries, whether it is in the EU or outside of it, creating local bonds or euro bonds, those alternatives are not being considered because the Trojka has the mandate and has no political will to change that situation. We believe that this situation is so bad that something must be done, and that something is Greek youth violent acts. And what do we mean when we say violent acts? It means that they have a legitimacy to go against sources of authority, whether it is vandalism, whether it is the attacking of police forces or state buildings, and so on, to have violent slogans and to vandalize. What is it not? It is not homicide. It is not hurting innocent bystanders that have nothing to do with your cause, and it is not the hijacking of such movements by political forces. We believe that this should be limited to Greek youth and not to any other organization which just tries to get its aims through what we are talking about. I'm going to show why we believe that this is a legitimate act for them to do regardless of the consequences, and why we believe that even in the what will happen next, we will have a better influence on Greek and, more important, European politics that can end this situation. Now, when do we think it is legitimate to use violence? First of all, when the issue is really important, which I already established, but that is not enough. When there is no other alternative. And why do we think that there is no other alternative? Because we believe that those decisions about austerity are not even decided by the Greek government. They are decided by an outside force in Europe, meaning that you as a citizen do not have the tool of going to the poll box and giving, because this is not relevant. It is being forced on you from the outside, and you have no way of choosing a different Angela Merkel if you want Germany's policy towards Greece to be different. Second of all, because we believe that the alternatives of having writing letters to your congressman or having an online document stating that you object this is not enough, because there is no true political incentive to listen, and because it is not shown to actually represent, because you can always dismiss it as poor statistics, and because not all people have the access to the media, to even internet and computers, or the money if they want to create their own movement or their own party, which is not something that the Greek youth can do, meaning that they have no better alternatives. But even more important to that, we say that if they wait, the damage will be irreversible. And what do we mean? First of all, it means that they will have already lost, they will not have the jobs, they will not have the way to improve their future, and they might live a long life of suffering. And worse than that, we believe that if they don't do something, Political movements like the Golden Dawn can rise more easily because they will use the situation of despair and of continuing austerity in order to radicalize the public, meaning that we need a change now and not to wait for something better that might come in the future. And further than that, we say that if the government that you give the monopoly on violence betrays you, you have the right to take that monopoly on violence back from it in order to achieve what you want as a society. Before I continue, I'll take a second.
Okay, why do you ignore the context of the Eurozone, what's happening right now? You have IMF said that austerity was an issue, it was problematic at the beginning. You have economical experts who are saying that austerity
Thank you very much. Now, we believe that this is not urgent enough. We believe that those voices are not heard. There needs to be a political momentum, which brings me to my second point. Why we believe that this thing will actually have a good influence. Because when you have violence, you have, first of all, more media exposure. Second of all, if people get violent, it means that there is something so bad that people are willing to risk their own safety, being caught in a violent act or going to prison or being injured themselves because they suffer so much, meaning that you create a sense of urgency. Now, you create a sense not only in Greece but in the rest of Europe. And since Europe does want to remain integral and it will not want images such as this to affect its own image and the way it conducts itself, we believe that this will create among other European decision makers the feeling of fear, and of this is something that needs to be contained, meaning we have to do something different. We need to sit with them. We need to promise them something in order for them to stop and not light the streets of Greece. And also a willingness to please. We believe that this might be a harsh way of conducting negotiation, but it is a more effective way to do so that will affect the rest. Now, why do we believe that this kind of violence will eventually stop or be contained and not turn into complete chaos? Because we believe, first of all, that we will have some sort of reaction from the political bodies, meaning that they will do something to stop this. Second of all, because we believe that if the youth does see that there is an attempt to try and solve things, they will stop and they will become more pragmatic, because eventually what they want is not violence. They want violence for change. So if they have a hope of change, we believe that they will not continue and simply everything. For all of those reasons, we call you to do the only thing to change the situation.
I'd like to thank Bonnie for their speech. To open the case of the opposition, I'd now like to welcome Ellen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I move on into my constructive case and explain to you basically why, first of all, violence is not okay in its core principle, and second of all, why isn't effective? It is not effective. It doesn't really work to use it. I am going to go into some rebuttal of what we have heard from side government up until now. Error number one from side government. They have been talking in the future tense. The thing is that the violent protests have been happening since 2009, and the reality is that nothing has changed due to the those violent protests. As I'm going to explain to you into my constructive case, most of it has actually, those violent protests have actually harmed any tries, any efforts that they have made to make an actual change. Second of all, they have come up here and they said that there are no alternatives. Not true. Since 2009, we have, which is when the violent process actually began, we have 3 national elections plus 1 European, and they have been mentioning the rise of Golden Dawn, and they choose to ignore the rise of the left at the same time. Plus, the youth of Golden Dawn is down. Now, they also said that, you know, more violence creates more media exposure. Yes, wrong kind of exposure. And this is exactly why we are going to be arguing why this kind of thing is not what we want. Last but not least, they have said, you know, that they mentioned that, you know, not homicide, not hijacking. What we say is that actually, those are the results, and we have witnessed those are the results of the violence protests that have been happening since 2009. So this is not something that we can ignore, and this is not something that we will ignore in our case. Moving on to my constructive case. Yes.
The taking down of apartheid, which was partly done violently, took many, many years. Therefore, effectiveness was not seen immediately. Do you think it was better to leave the attack on apartheid and leave the fact that we were trying to take it down?
Yes, and I'm going to tell you why, because into my constructive case. Before I do that, I am going to say that, you know, violent protest is the wrong kind of tension, and it is harmful in itself. We are okay with non-violent protests, and we are okay with non-violent protests because they are the ones that, you know, actually can achieve something, and we believe that they can achieve something in the future. Now, why violence it is not okay in its core principle? First of all, they actually cause harms firstly to other citizens, because of the harm on commercial properties, on the harm of, you know, burning actually down buildings, and then we have actually had accidents. For example, the accident at it's not actually accident, when the general strike occurred, and, you know, employees, despite the havoc that was going down, to go actually to work, we had a Molotov building, and we had 3 people dying. This is not okay, ladies and gentlemen. These are the results of the violent protests, and because they end up in deaths and people being harmed, we believe that this is why violence in itself, it's not okay to use. And thirdly, publicity. It is a right kind of attention, because at the end of the day, it was publicizing and was said that we remembered about that protest, what was the incident, was how many victims we had, was the fact that someone threw a Molotov, was how wrong the action of doing that was, how wrong it is to burn down properties in order to, you know, try to achieve something else in the beginning. And lastly, it is against the democratic process, ladies and gentlemen. In a country like Greece, where democracy, it's supposed to be in its core, when you do have free press, when, you know, when have free press, you have internet, you have access to all that. It is not okay to voice your opinions through violence. You have a chance to voice your opinion down. It's not like you have no other option like they have been claiming. Secondly, why is an effective way it does not work? First of all, let's take this empirically, that nothing has due to the violent process up until now, since 2009. Now, let's take this to an international level. First of all, we haven't, like, the small changes that were made through the negotiations, and all that violent protest that did was actually harm those negotiations. How? Because those violent protests undermine the government's capacity to negotiate internationally. What we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, is because of the large effect, like the large scale that those protests took, at the end of the day, it looked like there was no control from the government over its people. So it looks like, you know, the government has no control. So there are issues raised in terms of a democratic collapse, ladies and gentlemen. And those issues were made, which at the end of the day, any kind of a negotiation you were trying to make to escape through, you know, those mandatory austerity measures is not going to go down well, because you look like you have no power of the people. You cannot control the situation. And now let's take this to a domestic impact. First of all, it's not conducive to actually a proper dialogue and a reasonable dialogue about the austerity measures. They are being the youth that is engaging into that is being characterized as thugs, and you do not listen to them and what they actually have to say. And this is where we go actually into the youth part of this debate. Basically, by the, you know, the people the part of them, of that youth that is being characterized as thugs, and the rest of them are being brushed off as thugs as well. And it undermines the capacity of the youth to raise their voice on those issues. And they are the voice of the austerity measures are not about, about what we're going to do currently in our economy, but creating a sustainable economy in the future. And what we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that because exactly of the unemployment rate that exists right now in Greece, which is 27% in total, 60% of it being on the youth, means that it is the ones who are more directly affected, and they are the directly affected, exactly because they have, they're not the ones who have interest into balancing only the budget for the next year, like, the more older people are, but it's about surviving of the rest of their lives. It's about creating actually sustainable economy. And we believe that we should be trying to facilitate their voice and their conversation. And we believe that violent protest is not the way to do that. For the above reasons, we beg to oppose the motion.
I'd like to thank Eleni for the speech. To continue the case to the government side, I'd now like to welcome Jan.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about, first of all, I'm going to talk to you about tyranny and why violence is legitimate and justified against tyranny. Second, I'm going to talk to you more about the effective impact of using violence, specifically when you are a weakened population and there is such a large imbalance of power between the decision maker who victimizes you. Let's start with a rebuttal. First, let's tackle the whole idea from opening up about the negative exposure that the Greek youth is going to get. Well, we actually think that it's more likely that, as Monica explained and was not really refuted, those people who are protesting have an end goal. They have a specific something they want to achieve. They don't just want to go around smashing helmets of police officers, right? Meaning they have an interest to maintain this kind of battle, this kind of protest, exactly in the right amount that is effective to achieving this goal. They don't have an interest to show themselves as like completely crazy and so forth. Second, we think that austerity itself is a cause of a negative image of exactly those youth, meaning people in Germany thinking that those people are lazy and exactly deserve what they get. So we're thinking that on the comparative, we really don't want to live with the image that happens right now, and we would actually, this is not something that is worth fighting for or preserving. Third, we think that even if the EU considers these protesting youth as bullies, as hooligans, whatever. The EU has no interest right now to break the union. They have no interest to push Greek out of the union, meaning even if we don't really, as the EU, we're not crazy about them as partners, we still want them in regardless of how bad they act. Second point of rebuttal, damage, no. Collateral damage, no. Damage to other civilians. Look, taking Gaddafi out of power also hurts civilians. Every time you try to put down a tyranny, every time you're trying to fight for your basic right, you might hurt somebody. That doesn't mean that the struggle is bad or not worth it. Now, we don't really buy into this whole script of people are going to die and so forth, because Monica has said, and quite correctly, we're not talking about walking around in the streets slashing the throats of cops or whatever. We're talking about vandalism, and we're talking about like quite a reasonable violence that happens between cops that have helmets and stuff like that. We don't think that people are actually going to die. And if some protesters are going to die, it is their right to risk themselves for fighting tyranny. Relax, Michael. Okay, third, and we think that under your scare, under your world, more people are going to be hurt, more people are going to die. Why? Because poverty, under such devastating poverty, more people get sick and die. You have more crime, more people are being pushed into crime, meaning are being pushed to violence. No. Violence and murder and so forth. We think that in general you have more incidents like Golden Dawn, hurting immigrants and minorities and so forth under your world is worse. Third point of rebuttal, no. She said the protest is now working right now. Well, maybe people just don't feel empowered enough to raise their voice. Maybe they will feel, maybe you will get more protest under our view of the world because people actually feel that they have to do that their voice will be heard. Let's go to my first point. Let's talk about tyranny. Ladies and gentlemen, this is how we were born, and we have every right to self-preserve our freedom under tyrannical reign. And this is what Monica showed you today. Those are the decision. Our future as Greek youth, our future is being negatively set by a government that doesn't care about us, by a government that we cannot influence. This is the basis of tyranny. And consider this kind of protest as self-defense against a regime that I cannot alter otherwise. Meaning, if under my perspective, this regime is basically enslaving me, meaning condemning me to such a devastating way of life, this regime has absolutely no legitimacy to do it and no legitimacy to demand a monopoly of power when engaging with me. I'll start my second point and then I'll take you away. Okay? So, we established that it is legitimate. Now let's establish that this is the most effective, in fact, the only effective way to do it. Why? Every time there is a political struggle of a weakened population, and if we think about these Greek youth, as opposed to the decision makers, the people who are actually forcing this austerity upon them, there is such a balance of power, there is absolutely no way to encounter it. What are we saying here? We're saying that every political struggle like this needs like a front line, a really aggressive front line that triggers fear in the heart of the decision makers. Think about Malcolm X as opposed to Martin Luther King. If you don't strike fear in the heart of the people who oppress you, they have absolutely no inclination to be mitigated towards your need. They have no interest. They have no reason to even listen to what you have to say. They have absolutely no reason whatsoever to meet you halfway, meaning you will get absolutely nowhere. I'll take a POI from second.
Greece is not a failed state. You still have alternatives to democracy. You have Syriza, who is currently winning 5 to 8% in political states.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe we're not completely buying that those particular population who are now fighting feel that they even have some kind of power on their own government, but this is not what we are saying. This is not really the decision of the Greek government. This is the decision being imposed by the EU, by Merkel, by people who the Greek people have no sway on their decision making. That's what we're talking about for 14 minutes. Okay, so basically what we're saying is like this. Think about the US. Think about Jimmy Hoffa, the leader of the working men, the leader of the Teamsters and so forth. Not a very positive person, right? Or someone who is like quite questionable, violent. But without Jimmy Hoffa, without the corporation being scared of this kind of negative power, you will not have any discussion, you will not have any inclination to consider workers' rights at all. Meaning, once you have this aggressive, this violent, this threatening line, putting itself out there, only when you do that, you will get to the second stage of actually getting into a constructive negotiation and dialogue, which is the best thing for Greece, and for those reasons we call
I'd like to thank Yael for her speech and continue to get to opposition. I think that's also
Wait. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to talk about in my speech is the harms that we see that are caused in terms of economic recovery in Greece more broadly, not relating to the austerity measures, but as a consequence of the violent protests. But before I do that, there are a few things from the opposition, opening and closing, interestingly enough, that I want to look at. First of all, the claims we hear from the opening team are things like austerity is bad. Protests are a good thing and important in democracy as a way of expressing opinions. Yes. Poverty is not nice. Certainly. What we don't hear from the opening opposition, from the opening government, is how do violent protests by youth in any way help in these issues, right? How do they help? And more importantly, how have they helped so far? Our case in the opposition and what they haven't responded to from Eleni's speech, fact that they have actually made things worse, right? They actually made the capacity of the Greek government to negotiating these things and the perception that the international community has of Greece and its willingness to negotiate worse. It made us weaker, which is where we hear the second claim from the opening government team, right? That Greece, it's the EU that decides, it's the Trojka that decides, it's not the Greek government. To a large extent, ladies and gentlemen, that's true. But again, we don't hear how their views on Greece acted on by the existence of the violent protests. We have gone over this again, and I'm going to talk about it more later on in the speech, about the fact that it actually created the perception of a government that was not in control, not to be trusted in negotiations, that was incapable of expressing the views of the people, that had absolutely no ability of maintaining law and order, and hence was not worth negotiating with, right? It created even globally in terms of media and society, not just within the Troika, but for the citizens of Germany, that Greek people were irresponsible, they were violent. As soon as something happened, they just started to kick off a fight and start killing people and destroying buildings. Which brings me on to two very important mischaracterizations from the government bench so far. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, how do protests work and how do they turn violent? Because what we hear from the opening team is this really optimistic scenario where they can distinguish between unions and other types of organization and youth, or they can distinguish between the youth that they like, the youth that advocates against austerity and helping people, sort of the leftist kind of youth, with the youth of the Golden Dawn that is also using violence, right? Here's the problem. They don't understand how protests turn violent, because you don't start a protest by saying this is going to be a violent protest. You don't announce that in advance. That would be quite stupid to do. What happens is that you have a mass protest that is a peaceful protest, and within that, violence tends to get sparked, and that's how these things are created, by groups within that. The problem with that, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's impossible to distinguish who are the groups that you like that are using violence from the groups that you don't like that are using violence. So these distinctions we hear from the opening team, no thank you, are completely, practically infeasible, because that escalation of violence actually means that the guys you like, the guys we think have a point in this debate and we want to support, actually, completely without intending to, provide cover with this escalation of violence for the guys we don't like. So it's very difficult then to distinguish when someone throws a Molotov bomb in a bank and kills people because the building is set on fire. That's what the destruction of property means, by the way, right? That's a side effect of that, and I haven't engaged with that harm. We also, ladies and gentlemen, you just provide that cover for what in Greece is, unfortunately, sometimes unions, but mostly fascists, when they attack immigrants in that cover. Secondly, very important mischaracterization by the proposition. What Greece is as a country and the sort of timing of these events. In first probe, we hear that there are no other means. This is the only way to make a point. In the POI from the closing, we hear would you support it in apartheid South Africa, right? Just pushing this debate to a massive extreme that has nothing to do with Greece. Here's the problem, right? Greece is a democracy. It's a flawed democracy. At times, it's a weak democracy. It's not perfect. Gonna be the first one to admit this. No.
definitely, ladies and gentlemen, not apartheid South Africa, right? We've had elections, we have national elections, European elections, and like we have ways of accessing free press, of having public discourse. These things exist, and even when they are not perfect, they are there and they are available. The problem is, and here's again an analysis from Eleni that we don't hear any response to, these things were made weaker when we had violent protests happening in Greece. No, thank you. So it became more difficult for those who didn't want to use violence to access these means to make a point. Secondly, and quite importantly, they didn't even attempt to exhaust the options. The violence started straight away as soon as the austerity measures were announced. In fact, they started before the exact measures were announced, right? Just because we knew something was going to happen around austerity. So this is not a desperation out of poverty. This is an immediate reaction. It didn't exhaust other options. Greece is a democracy, ladies and gentlemen, and the fact that these voices can be heard is very obvious from the fact that we've seen a gradual shift to the left in terms of the Greek politics. Now, like there are quite likely to be elections in February in Greece, presidential election, and Syriza, which is, no thank you, a party that has been advocating for renegotiations around the debt and the austerity measures, is gaining in the polls. And quite importantly, the timing of that increase in the rankings happens after the mass violence. Right? It's when Syriza is no longer, no thank you, and the left, the political left in Greece is no longer associated with irresponsible, violent behavior, but is rather seen as a party that can lead the country in these difficult times, that it massively gains in popularity and in polls. When people who don't like burning buildings think this might be the guy I can send to the EU and hold these negotiations. So this is how you see the shift happening in a democracy. Before moving on to why this harms our ability and capacity to recover economically more broadly, from closing.
You do realize that democracy in Greece doesn't function. We vote for the party that is against IMF, and all of a sudden, all obligations that we have towards IMF are gone. Obligations remain, and austerity remains. So what do citizens do if they're against austerity?
Wait, but it hasn't changed. There are anti-austerity parties, there are austerity parties. We're likely to have coalition governments. They're likely to negotiate. They are already negotiating, and they're making progress when they're negotiating, rather than when we're burning down buildings, which brings me on to the economic recovery. Because it's nice to talk about austerity and measures and Trojka, but here's the thing, right? Recovery doesn't just depend on what kind of measures are imposed on Greece. It also depends and requires that there is locally driven development. Here's the problem with that. This is massively prevented from happening, and our capacity to do this is massively restricted when there are violent protests happening in Greece, and we saw this happening, right? First of all, let's look at tourism, one of the major, actually the most major industry in Greece. When Athens was burning, protests they didn't visit, right? The tourism industry, our healthiest industry, suffered a huge loss and a huge drop when people were afraid to come. Investors were afraid to invest in an uncertain framework where they thought that the community, society, and collapsing. Our case in opening is very simple, ladies and gentlemen. Like, you can use. The problem with all of this is that if you want less austerity, you need to do things that don't make you weaker in your capacity to negotiate and change. And for these reasons, we beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank Kalina for that speech. To open the closing half of this debate, I'd now like to recognize Michael.
Mr. Speaker, I have a lot to do in this debate, but basically what we're going to hear about is, first of all, answer to a very important question we had from Kalina. Why is austerity bad? Why is it necessarily doing all these things that First Gov alluded to? The second thing is a bit of an answering to First Opposition's problems, which to most I can just answer, listen to First Government. In terms of the fact that it doesn't create absolute results and everything like that, that these are not necessarily the changes that we want, I'm perfectly fine with taking Deputy Prime which goes, yes, but it creates a front line, something that limits things, in the very essence of which, for example, Palestinian resistance to the Israelis may not create a Palestinian state, but at very least limits very much what Israel can do in Jerusalem in order to curtail riots right now. Okay, so I'm fine with that as well. In terms of the harms caused, what will form, again, there has been changes and things have changed. Merkel, in the end of the day, has made concessions that she was refusing to do in the beginning, and she will probably continue to do that. And the reason she will continue to do that is because Merkel needs a stable Greece, and if Greece is not stable because the people are not happy, eventually she will have to succumb to that. The fact that it is taking time, as I've shown in my POI, relevant. No, thank you. Okay, the second thing that they brought up, which is interesting, is this whole you don't know who it is that is violent. First of all, if you read the motion, fine, I'm supporting the one I do know that they are. If there's someone that I don't know who it is, I'm willing to say I'm not sure if I should support them or not, and obviously not the others. But about this whole issue with the violent side effect, that is sort of like fine. First, God would tell you that the violent side effect is at best for them equal to the violence caused by the state, which is forcing you to go through this, and we're going to show you exactly why that is so harm. So I'm not so sure why I should pick that side of violence and not the other violence at the very least. So no, thank you. Why is austerity bad, and why is the self-defense? If I have time for that. So why is austerity bad? And for this, we need to go into what the elements are that actually necessarily do this. Austerity basically means slashing in services and slashing in things the government gives, and actually demanding sometimes more taxes, sometimes less, but in the end of the day, it means that people who are poor are getting less services. I'll take the example of milk, but obviously you can extrapolate this later. So, for example, if milk is subsidized in my country, and I decide as part of austerity to cut down on milk, this means that the poor people who need milk at the same time are actually now going to either have to give up on milk or stop buying or buy it from their own pocket. What this creates is twofold things. One is that means for this very minimal services of milk, they are, instead of keeping that money with themselves, pushing that money up towards the elite and making the elites a lot stronger. Now, this also normally, of course, milk was just an example. This goes to education and stuff like that. This in itself limits market dynamics because you have one group that is basically siphoning all the money and going to. It tends to be, by the way, the group of elites that create and deal with these things today. They talk about you want local development in Greece. If you want local development in Greece, what you need is a dynamic purchasing power. What is making the elites today leave Greece is, yes, maybe some ties of the riots, but it's not like they're going to stay if you continue with the austerity measures, because there won't be a group that will be able to purchase their goods and be able to actually help them. Okay, this is actually, and this is done and the sad thing about this is because this is done between the IMF and everything, even the so-called representatives of Greece in the negotiation are actually elites who normally do not suffer from the lack of these services. Okay, for crying out loud, rich people couldn't care less if the milk costs $1 or it costs $2. No, thank you. But they do care. But they are willing to concede that because they have this paradigm of liberal thinking that actually less government intervention is good. Why do they have this? It is actually because they are more likely to adopt it, simply because that is the way they live. People, when they're successful, tend to find reasons why they deserve that, why they actually lived in a free market economy where their actual goods were, where their actual abilities were seen. Now, for the poor and for everything like that, this is extremely problematic, and we're going to get to that. Of course, what is the alternative, which is the big question? The alternative, Mr. Speaker, is actually achieving austerity and achieving desperate times as sometimes where you need to actually push money. It's Keynesian economics. It's where you need to push more money into the economy in order to help people succeed, in order to help people open a tourist area and stuff like that. Things that the rioters are generally in favor of. Okay, this has proved to work in World War II. This has proved to work with the recent stimulus in the United States. The reason it is not happening currently is exactly because the decision is made by elites who have the most to lose from such things, because these are the people who will push the money for, who will be having to give up their privileges and their money to go forward. Before I go to why this is self-defense, go.
Anthony Samaras is currently having talks with IMF to reduce the austerity.
Yeah.
Gain 15 billion from them.
Yeah.
And progress in 1 year, Greece recovered massively from austerity right now.
I'm actually glad to hear that. I'm glad that the violent protests since 2009 have made a change in the negotiations, unlike what First Government has said. This is excellent news. Thank you for bringing that up. I had no clue about this. Okay, now let's move to self-defense a bit. And this is something where we're adding a bit on government. Because government is right, the issue of not having another alternative is there. But it's not just that, right? Because you don't have other alternative but stopping in a red light in traffic. But we wouldn't think that is good for violence. It has to do with the level of effect it has on you, okay? They've already insinuated to losing jobs, but let's talk about where the problem really is. We'll use, for example, one of the reasons we're okay with abortion here on government, and they're okay too, even though some of them may not be, okay? Or defending your own country. Abortion, one of the reasons we're okay is not because we necessarily disagree that it is life, but because we think that when something is attacking your entire entity, your ability to be who you want to be, your ability to provide yourself, we think that it's perfectly fine to kill that entity, as innocent as it may be. If that example doesn't work for you, we think it is perfectly fine for you as well to come and say, defending your own country, for example, may not lead to death. It is not necessarily the Jews versus the Nazis where that means extermination. Sometimes, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, most Kuwaitis were actually actually pretty safe. We still thought Kuwait had a right to defend itself because Kuwait had a right to defend their way of life and defend the way that they want to act. What does all this mean? That the size of the problem also matter. Making you poor does exactly that, sir. When you lose job, you lose the ability to access education. Be who you actually lose the ability to reach better foods and better medicines, which also add to your quality of life from your food of life. And we think that in that aspect, it is a massive extreme, like First Gov tried to say, and apartheid is completely class discrimination works very racism, where you allow to happen that create a situation where some person, just because the world in which they were born in, is less likely to enjoy a full part of life. This is why we're fine with them hijacking this sort of like hijacking the conversation, because we believe that the tyranny, as the First Gov has said, of the majority is still a tyranny. And the reason we think it has to be the youth, Mr. Speaker, is because these are the able ones. In the end of the day, a 35-year-old mother who is the mother to a child cannot go and be politically active, but the youth can, and they represent a lot more than just themselves. They represent an entire class. We've shown you why the alternative is less likely to work, why we're fine with that the solution won't be a 100% one, but a better one, and we've shown you why this is a self-defense, not because of the lack of the option, because of the amount of damage that it does to you, the individual. Here.
I'd like to thank Michael for his speech. To open the case for closing opposition, I'd now like to recognize Golden.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. The problem with the whole government bench is that their actions do not lead to a Marxist revolution that will change the global economic and political setting in which demands austerity, at least some form of austerity, but on the other hand hurts the political leverage and the things that we can do through the current democratic process, through the current system. Okay, 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, violence is legitimate because we have no other alternatives. We don't think this is true. And we have democratic elections in Greece, we have Syriza, you have a public debates about this, and it is not true that the voices of those who are against austerity are not heard. Okay, we think that violence is legitimate only so far you have no other tools of social change and your rights are harmed in a very excessive, direct way, and that is going to be a rebuttal on the second government. But secondly, they say this is going to make concession. This is going to make Europe and Angela Merkel make concessions. We don't think this is true. We already had violent protest, and that didn't stop EU at appointing prime ministers to these sorts of governments and continuing their austerity measures, etc. We don't think that this is going to destabilize the country so much. This is going to have, I don't know, a civil war or massive. And even they say we're not going to kill anyone. So if you're not going to kill anyone, if you're only going to have vandalism, we don't think that it is a force that will make Europe make some big concessions they didn't already make. Now on the second government. Firstly, they say austerity is bad. We say austerity is a very generic term. So in a way, yes, austerity is bad if it is not combined with other economical policies or if it's done in a bad way. But we don't think that austerity is necessarily bad as such. Why? Because we think that the problem that we have within the current economical system in Greece was massive government debt and massive spending. And you had a lot of corruption. You had a lot of money that wasn't spent well, and the state that wasn't efficient, that was losing money, and the political parties which were powerful because they held all this power and they held all these government services, etc. that were having so much money. So we think that austerity, in the sense of lowering these services and lowering the budget and cutting the debt, is necessary in some form for Greece in order to have transitions, or if the alternative is not a communist society or abandoning capitalism because it hurts your right to free healthcare. So we think that in Greece we need to have some sort of austerity and we need to have some sort of this policy in order to have economic benefits. And now to the point point of self-defense, where it is a very big logical step, because he says, you have policies that hurt your social mobility, that hurt your hurt etc. And you don't have access to all these things, so you have a legitimacy to violently attack your society. But we think that there is no there is no direct link between these two things, because we think that both of the political economic ideologies are legitimate in a political discourse. One that says that we should have a free market, and then there were instances in which free market was an effective economical policy, and that saw and on the other hand, a Keynesian model. But the point is that the Keynesian model is not the only legitimate model. If it is if it was the only legitimate, and if it is the only model that had in history some positive benefits as compared to the others, then it would be legitimate to have violent protest. We think that both political ideologies are legitimate. Okay, now what happens when you do this? Yeah, before that,
Governments in Greece might change to even represent a bit more poor, but why would Germany care unless their own currency and image are endangered?
Germany cares more about the political party that is empowering Greece than the youth that are breaking windows on the Athens streets. That is what is more. We think that, and now I come to our extension, that one, this hurts the movements that are trying to negotiate things with Europe, because they will lose support of this, because this demands from them ideological purity. And second, how this alienates youth and hurts the political. So firstly, you have now a situation that that these left movement gained some political leverage. It is not true when Shapiro answered the POI and said, yeah, but that was because of the protest. No, that was because you have more leftist parties that are able to influence policies, are able to influence these kinds of negotiations, not because of Angela was scared of Greek hooligans. That is the reason why you have this kind of leverage. And now you have Syriza gaining advantage in the polls and maybe being able to enter government. Once it enters governments, for two reasons. Firstly, we said that it is need to have some form of austerity, and secondly, because it is in this political economical system needed, we think that they will need to negotiate some form of austerity. Why is that not problematic for them? Because up until now, it was easy for them to be a pure communist left-wing party. Once they gain power, if they want to have a real political change, and if they want to really do something that governments wants us to do, they will need to have to explain it to their voters and to explain it to the public. To explain it that in political process you need to make some concessions, especially if you're negotiating with someone so powerful as the Trojka, as the EU. Why we think this hurts it? Because if you have this kind of violent protest, it means that the public demands a more pure approach to the solving of this problem. It means that it radicalizes the people who are now totally categorically against austerity. We don't think that is a good thing. We don't think they never showed us to which results this will lead. I think we're outside in a house with a strong left wing that can actually negotiate these things without having to be ideological pure. It is better. But it is also problematic because when you go to a violent protest and when you violently protest against the government and enter with clashes with police, etc., you're alienated from that political process. That means you don't want to vote. You don't want to have those alternatives they are claiming that do not exist but actually exist. That means that these parties that can actually change something lose the support. On the other hand, you have lost energy of these people who are just getting harming themselves, harming the stability of their country, and not getting, because they are not going to get this through in any kind of political process. For these reasons, we beg violently protest against austerity.
I'd like to thank Nicola for the speech. To close the case for the government side, I'd now like to welcome
May I? Thank you.
Three things to summarize this debate. Number one, why we think that this is actually a justified revolution and why violence is justified. Number two, why we think that this is actually very efficient. And three, why we think that change will be good. Before that, a couple of points of rebuttal. Firstly, why we think negotiations will fail, brought up by the opening opposition. Firstly, as my partner already explained, most of the politicians don't really care because they don't feel the impacts of austerity, so it's questionable how much will they actually push for those changes. But secondly, even if they do care, think that they're strong enough to fight against Trojka for vast majority of reasons. Trojka has their own interest and they're willing to push austerity. So what is the worst if on negotiations Trojka says no to that government? People will not vote for that government, someone else will change their place, and Trojka will still continue with their policies. So they literally have no interest into changing what it is. Trojka is so powerful that sometimes governments and elites of certain states are not strong enough. You also need people to be with their government in those fights in order for those fights to be more constructive and more successful, but more on that in my clashes. Also, the closing opposition comes out and says, but they're trying to create this global change. Not necessarily. Firstly, we'll change it on a local level. Less austerity measures in Greece. We're perfectly happy. We think that that also has tendency to spread globally. Once other states see that austerity measures isn't necessarily a must-have in order to have a good economy, we think that other states that have to implement austerity right now, which are not happy with implementing austerity measures, once they see that in one state that turned out to be successful, might also reconsider it. So by our plan, we're actually going more change rather than we're going with what are they suggesting. In terms of the protest, we think that the negotiations that started will probably the fact that those violent protests actually happened, because otherwise they would have no interest to sit down and to negotiate, because protests were actually an issue. If the problem is that they didn't solve enough issues that they should have, we should have more protests and more violent protests, therefore more motivation for Angela Merkel to sit down and to talk to someone. Also, what we want to say, if your issue is the political parties are corrupted, that sent Trojka to Greece to control corruption within the parties, not to implement austerity measures. Plus, austerity measures are even worse when it comes to corrupted regimes, because in austerity measures, all the money goes to elites. If elites are corrupted, that means that they're even less likely to spend that money in the way that that money actually should be spent. So either change the corruption, or if you don't want to change the corruption, then definitely you should not implement austerity measures. And also, if their problem is that Keynesianism isn't ideal, fine, find another alternative. It doesn't have to be Keynesianism, but it doesn't have to be austerity, because obviously people do not want to live in austerity measures. Now, on to clashes. Firstly, justification. So firstly, we think that you definitely do have the right to pursue your own happiness. We definitely think that you have the right to fight against something that obviously harms you. Firstly, let's prove to you that people directly feel impacts of austerity measures. You lose your job, you lose your salary, you have much less amount of money, you can give to yourself much smaller life rather than you would. So yeah, it's but the second issue is that austerity is generally bad. As my partner explained, you have a lot of long-term gaps that will be created because money will be given to the elites. Elites will have interest to keep that money with themselves. If you add the fact that we're talking about Greece, that probably means they're corrupted, which means even less incentive for them to actually do something constructive with that money, which means that gap between poor and the rich will probably remain to exist. Who's going to be impacted by that? Mostly the youth, because the longer the system remains, the harder is for it to be fight against, because it's getting into people's skin, remains to exist, and gives you smaller chances to actually ever change something. But now we have to tell you, okay, we've proven it's legitimate ground to fight against it. But why violence? Couple of reasons. Firstly, you individually can't change anything. If you lost your job and you live in a country of austerities, there's no way you're going to get that job, regardless how capable you are, regardless how good qualities you have. Secondly, voting in democracy completely loses its point. Yeah, I'm going to vote for a government that is going to be against austerity measures, and then they will sit with Angela Merkel, and I'm sure Greece politicians will be able to fight against the in European Union. No, that doesn't happen. What actually happens, you change the government, you get that false idea that something is going to change, that Angela says no again, and in the end, nothing really changes, which means you don't have impact on your government, nor your policies. But in the end, you can't even directly impact on the Trojka. Why? They're too strong, they're too far away, you have no means, you have no education to fight against them, and in the end, this is in their interest because it the domination that they have within European Union, and with austerity measures they have the means to even perpetuate that domination that I have right now. Before I go closing.
Okay, but the stability, political stability Greece currently has, gained that investment, new negotiations, and that's exactly what Trojka wants.
Yeah. That is the issue. You get the false idea that something is going to change and that tomorrow the new negotiations will actually change something. But that doesn't really happen. You still remain in austerity measures, you still remain dominated by bureaucracy of European Union or by bureaucracy of Germany, and you don't really get to change anything. Now, why we think that this is actually going to be more effective? Because
of protesting is bound to fail. Why? Because it can go under the carpet. So if we're talking about protests online, obviously we can censorship it or just make it irrelevant. If we're talking about any other types of protests, they're not dangerous, because obviously the worst case, you will change your government and vote for someone who is against austerity measures and nothing will happen again. You're still remaining in this system. When you have these kind of violent revolutions, it has to be everywhere because of big risks, because of potential harms, which means that it enters the discourse, which means that you will finally have a pressure on Trojka and Germany and other people to start changing themselves and to start changing their policies, because they will be able to realize how far are people willing to go in order to change their system and how unhappy they are. But even more than that, the thing with violence that differentiates it from any other types of protest is the spillover effect that happens. So once you have a lot of youth that went out on the street, you will finally motivate a lot of people that are struggling with austerity measures, that are completely against austerity measures, but not motivated to get out on the street. As my partner said, 35-year-old mother is probably not gonna dress up, go out and protest because she lost a job, because she believes that she doesn't have time for that those protests are not gonna be successful, that she's not able to mobilize enough people for that. Once you have the youth out on the street, you are aware of the fact that there is someone who supports you out there, who already made the first step, and that you get to join it. And that is the moment when the spillover effect happens. What is the issue with spillover effect? Because it creates a lot of damage. And that is the moment where you have to change something. Because everything can be stopped. Peaceful protests can be stopped. Anything, block protests, everything can be stopped. Violence can only be stopped if you fulfill the conditions. Because otherwise there's no way for you to control the masses. And that is how European Union has to change. In the end, why change is good? Because benefits can be reached without austerity. You give money to poor people, they invest that money in something else, they make profit out of it, the economy goes. What do we get in the end? A, we get bigger chances for everyone gets the money, everyone gets to invest, everyone gets to earn. B, everyone gets higher quality of life because from the profit I've made, I get to make something for myself or buy something for myself. And that's how we reach the stable system. We're having happy people, content people who live in the system they voted for and not the system imposed by European Union. For all these reasons, proud to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Nelson for the speech. To close the case for the opposition, debate as a whole, I'd now like to welcome.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Hi everyone. Two things I would like to analyze today before as a summation speaker. One, context and who stands up in reality check, because we show so many generic approach to Greece by the side of government. Second point, analysis of Syriza, what came out for Sugaris, and why do we actually win this debate throughout. When we analyze context, I would first like to say, Sugaris started his speech, the system will survive. Capitalism will survive no matter what Greece does. What does it mean? It means the debt and every money they actually owe to IMF will still stay there. What happens if this violent approach starts up, government goes down? They need to go into the bankruptcy. Why? Because they will not be able to pay anymore, because people will suddenly be started to say we will not pay anymore. What does it mean? It means more recession in that economy. What does it at the end means? More people being poor. How do we confront that? We say when you pay up currently and constantly, you gain leverage because Trojka wants money from you, and when you're currently paying up, when you say, okay, I have problems, now they say, okay, let's help you with that problems, and this is how we came up to the days negotiation we actually have with them. Of analysis of context right now is self-defense. Well, Greece had to do something with the situation they are in. They lied. The government to the USA insurance companies. They lied to the European Union. Their fault resulted in this situation that we have. Someone needs to have to pay up. The same analogy can be used. The people in prisons have right to self-defense, but guess what? You went directly against the system. You have some of your liberties taken away. Thank you on that logic. Now, when we came up and we constantly through our points stated the next thing, era of memorandum is over. Anthony Samaris stood up a few weeks ago and said, what did he actually meant by this? And this is when I said Greece is definitely not a failed state. First, you have the massive rise in the last year. You had touristic season, which was great by, I think, 20% bigger than the rest of them. Thirdly, you have new talks, and later in that next point, but one of the most important things is new actors emerging and invest in the Greece. China invested 240 millions on the airport in order to have more trade. That's the new insight, that your credit loan in the future will be better. And this is how Greece is not that problematic society as they say. People are dying. This is the way we're defeating them on the content of urgency. Now, when we come back to that stability and that new talks, what they actually mean, because no one left me to give me time to end this point, what it actually means. Now, because they saw the Greeks have new people, new parties inside who are left-wingers, when they see that Greece is still economy, when they saw the new actors are here to invest, they say, okay, we could have talks. Now, these talks means that we will take away $15 billion from your debt. That means that in 1 year, you will have austerity reduced. This is analysis of my point that this already was in the debate. Now, what does it mean? This will all massively be hurt by stability. What they said, okay, we have new people rising up. We have new youth here coming to do. How does that singles, no thank you, how does that singles the European Union, the youth, the new agents of that market are suddenly against this system. That means in the long-term stability of our investment is problematic because someone is already burning them up to be showing that they're not interested in cooperation. And this is problematic, and I think you will agree, but later on. Now, I believe one, but before I go on, Shapiro, I want to...
Yes, we have so far being the only ones that gave you an analysis on why austerity is evil. Can you explain why it is moral to create such gaps and exactly that actually live for a long term and as we've seen just serve the elite?
Austerity is evil. A, good job. Everyone knows this in this debate. B, Greece had its... And at C, we shown you through our analysis that we stated out that the differences are not so problematic. And even more, we show you through the analysis of investment that differences will not be so dramatic in the future because new people can emerge in that market. This is when Anthony Samaras came up and said, era memorandum is over. He also, yes, thank you. He said the new people, small markets can come up. If you have a good, strong touristic seasons, you can open different hotels, more hotels, different variety of them, and offer. You also have more trade. No, thank you. Now, when it comes to the most important part of this debate, it's the Syriza. And constantly to Nicola's speech, in my points, you had these several points of analysis. A, they're having huge, first their ideology is left-wing. B, they're targeting youth. Why? Because youth is here to stay. If you change their mindset, in the long run you have people who are voting for you. What does it mean? You already have an alternative. This is how we confront alternatives in this debate. And we say you have it, and even what's more important, by the analysis that Syriza will be included in the government in the next year or two when the elections will come in Greece, you will have that alternative already in the system. What does it mean? The benefits of it, here comes analysis, is that you will still have good credit ratings with the IMF because you still have sustainable government on the top. No, thank you. Now, second point of this is who actually is leading them. The one who's leading them is Alexis Tsipras. I'm not really sure if I'm pronouncing him right. That's the person who's leading Syriza. And he's the active member. First of all, he's galvanizing youth, from Sugari's speech, to support him. Second of all, he's here to negotiate and present the left-wing ideology as the one who's here to actually be negotiated with. No, thank you, I will not accept questions anymore. What does it mean, further on, that person is the one who represents the majority of Greece, and B, is efficient in that representation. Why? Because he's the one who's going from Angela Merkel to IMF, to World Bank, and saying this is the situation in Greece. When you have this situation in Greece, this is the solutions. More investment, more competition, and we will come up and rise up. The stability in him is that he will win the next election, and you have him in the system. No, thank you. Now to the crux of our case. Why do we need to have the youth not rampaging on the streets? But when you say them, when you support them to rampage on the streets, you're supporting them to go against Syriza's current ideology. And that's the negotiation. You're saying them you should go and burn the property of those companies. But what you should actually saying them, you should go and we should negotiate. We should reassemble our power of negotiation of our stability and our situation in Greece. And we should talk with the IMF. The situation is when you say to the youth that you should be included in the system, you actually giving them the reason and the way to change it from within. In the year or two, when we win elections, when Syriza wins, and new terms and we actually have $15 billion reduced, we will have a good standoff to create a better market, the Greek up. Now, to summarize my summation is the next thing. We show you the stability. We show that Greece is not a failed state. You have reasons to come up from it. Especially one of those reasons is the youth to be more active in political way through Syriza. We gave you that agent, we win on that merit.